Listen-only mode.
Well, welcome everyone to our Building Smart Canada members community meeting from March 2017. These meetings are brought to you by our member community committee, which is joined with our communications committee. So myself, Susan Keenley-Side, Carl Vayette, Eric Poirier, and Claudia Cositorto. If you have any suggestions for us of speakers or presentation topics that you want to hear about, you're welcome to contact us at information@ibc-bsc.ca. We continue to look for both local projects, local requests, as well as trying to bring some of the international projects and speakers that are of interest as well. So our guest today is Krigh Bachmann. He's Manager of Design Technology at DIALOG here in Canada. He's spent a number of years in the UK, working over there under the UK's BIM Level 2 initiative. And so he's going to present to us some of his experience and understanding of the UK's BIM Level 2 from that experience. So we're very pleased to have Krigh here today with us. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, you're probably one of the very few. But just to recap, if you want to communicate with us, all of your mics are on mute, so you'll need to either hit the raise hand button, or more commonly, you can type in a question in the comment box for us, and we will be taking questions at the end of Krigh's presentation. And you're welcome to submit your questions or comments throughout the presentation. We'll keep those, and Eric will manage those at the end. Donc, pour notre communauté francophone, on a vu déjà que c'est plus facile d'avoir une rencontre, puis on va traduire comme il faut. On sait bien que le niveau d'anglais des francophones est beaucoup plus élevé que le niveau de français pour les anglophones. Donc, on vous remercie beaucoup pour votre collaboration. On essaie toujours d'améliorer nos façons d'accueillir notre communauté francophone. Donc, sentez-vous bien à l'aise de poser vos questions en français, puis on va les traduire ensemble. Même si vous avez besoin des traductions de qu'est-ce qui a passé en anglais, on va le traduire puis parler un petit peu en français à la fin si vous êtes en besoin. So just to update briefly on our members community, we do have over approximately 465 members in Building Smart Canada at the moment. We do continue to promote our affiliate program with some new groups coming up soon. We're always trying to build our network of excellence across Canada. And our latest addition to our suite of what we offer as a members community is our new forum. We have launched both an alpha, and now we're in a beta launch of this forum. We are collecting best practices on this forum. We're not focused on picks and clicks of software per se, but getting to understand the different best practices and overall use of BIM in Canada at the moment. So we are looking for beta testers. If you haven't signed up already, I encourage you to go on, make a profile. It's free. You can post new questions. You can respond to existing questions. We have a very good suite of moderators that are BIM managers across the country that are moderating this forum. So you can be sure to get a response soon. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Krigh to present on the UK's BIM Level 2. So thanks, Krigh, for joining us.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I can show my screen now, and I'll switch it over. So you guys can see that? Okay. So yeah, thank you for joining. I wanted to kind of share my experience about BIM Level 2, and thankfully, talking to Eric about it, I put together a little bit of a presentation here. So we'll just get right into it. Okay, so first of all, just as a bit of a brief introduction, and by the way, I'm using Prezi, so I apologize if it's a little bit choppy. I'll try to pause on the slides. But a little bit about myself. I am the Manager of Design Technology at DIALOG. I'm I spent 8 years in the UK. I am originally Canadian, so I don't have the English accent. But while I was over there, I was BIM manager for Gensler's London office, as well as Pollard Thomas Edwards. And it was actually through PTE that I got involved with the BIM for Local Governments group, which is an offshoot of the actual BIM Task Group that set up BIM Level 2. So it was specifically addressing how do you take BIM Level 2 and apply it specifically to local governments. And that was because of the affiliation that I was with a group that worked a lot with local authorities. And part of that, I was also part of the London construction program in London. DIALOG, just in case you're kind of a little bit curious, we're multidisciplinary practice, international now, based out of San Francisco, as well as 4 locations in Canada. And we are sort of a forward-thinking technology group, but as part of that, we've also started talking to our clients about, and the industry about, BIM Level 2 and BIM requirements on projects and BIM standards. So it's something where this is all part of us kind of trying to share back with the industry about what we've learned and what we know. So the objectives here of what I'm going to try to quickly cover this session is going to be a quick high-level summary. There is a lot to BIM Level 2, but what I'm going to try to give you is the concept of what it was all about, where it came from, and why it was important inside the UK as well as internationally. So understanding the basic framework of that, but I'm not going to necessarily get into the depths of it, but what I'm going to touch on is sort of providing you with a path for further research if you want to kind of know more about it. I did get my BIM AP, BIM Accredited Professional, through a BRE course, which a lot of this stuff is actually drawn from. So, this is material that was actually taught by some of the creators of BIM Level 2. So hopefully I can bring you some of that, as well as, experience that I've got in applying it within the industry. But I've also sort of chimed in with a few of my opinions about, the pros and cons about BIM Level 2, because it's one of those ones where when you just kind of hear it as this is BIM Level 2, you think it's great, but then there's the whole reality of how it actually sets in. So I'll try to bring that to the table today. So a lot of it is that, when you kind of come back to what this whole thing was driven about, this was actually a quote, the fact that, architectural information is inaccurate, ambiguous, and incomplete. This was actually a quote from 1910, and it kind of goes to show you that this is a problem that we've had long ago within our industry, and how do we actually address it? So within the UK, there was a bit of a history to it. It basically had sort of a series of reports and reviews that were done by different groups over the years, going back as far as 1994. There's sort of things that happened where they recognized that there was a problem, they didn't have a solution, they tried to accelerate things. The government kind of chimed in with, what their thoughts were on it with infrastructure costs. And you eventually got to the point where it started to build towards a strategy that was reinforcing that we needed to invest in BIM. And as part of that, the biggest milestone for the UK government was the government construction strategy in 2011, in which it actually specifically had a point in it which the UK government believed that they could reduce the costs on projects by 20%. By employing information-rich building information technologies. So they basically identified that BIM was one of the key things in actually reducing capital cost and carbon on their projects. Now, a lot of people kind of jump at this and go, oh, money saving. But when you actually get into it, the important thing to understand is that when they say that it's a reduction of capital cost, they're talking about not 20% of extra money that we're going to have on a project, but more that we're not going to have these projects that, as you've seen in the, so many projects in the past where they go over time and therefore overspending and over money, and there's all these complications that weren't anticipated. And basically that, $1 million project now costs or now a $100 million project will now cost 120. They think, why can't we get that $100 million project for $100 million? So with that in mind, it's the idea of trying to anticipate what the planned cost is and actually come in under it. So this was kind of the big driver behind it. And why did the UK government step in? because they spent 44 billion pounds, approximately, that you're almost doubling that for Canadian dollars kind of thing. That's a lot of money, and it's also a quarter of the construction cost in the UK. So this was something where they said, if we can reduce this by 20%, that's a huge saving. So with all that in mind, that's why they came up with a construction strategy. Now, that construction strategy was built as kind of a few different pieces and a few different major players kind of coming together over a few years. And what they identified out of that was that they needed to develop a proper strategy. How are we going to implement this? And within the UK, I should say from my experience, a lot of people hear all this stuff and they go, wow, they must be so advanced. They're actually not as ahead when it comes to things like the implementation of, using Revit and using, the other BIM products. They actually were looking at the US and Canada and saying, well, they're ahead in Revit adoption, but we think we've got a better idea when it comes to how this all works out strategy-wise. So what they set about doing was creating a task group, and it was funded by the government. It was formed of industry professionals working with government groups. So it helped supported the public sectors. And the mandate that they actually had was a minimum collaboration of BIM Level 2 by April 2016, but on only government projects. There's a lot of confusion about that. It's government-funded, central government-funded projects. So, Ministry of Justice, Department of Defense, that kind of thing. Any of their big, large projects basically had to be BIM by 2016. I'll talk about it, or I'll definitely try to throw in there. I'll mention kind of later on what the actual requirement was as of April 2016 when we start to explain a bit more of the pieces behind it. So, as I said, they jumped in. They were kind of, from my experience, kind of playing catch up, but they identified the need for standards. They identified the need to address client requirements. They looked at it as a life cycle driven, not just design. A lot of the stuff when I, from my experience of looking at what was happening in North America, and this is more my opinion kind of thing, but from what I saw when I was looking back across the ocean is a lot of the stuff that was developed here felt like it was driven by kind of, it started within architecture and engineering, and it kind of grew from that into construction, but it didn't seem to quite capture that holistic approach. And I think within the UK, they had the advantage that they were almost starting with a clean slate. So they sort of said, okay, what are the pieces that we need to put in place? And how do we address that? So, and then inevitably, so everyone always sort of says, well, why BIM Level 2? And this, I've talked to so many people that if you go to BIM conferences in the UK, they have BIM bingo, just of the things that you'll see over and over and over again. And the wedge is probably one of the most overused graphics, but it helps explain what the strategy was about, which is that they said, well, why is it, where are we starting at? We're starting out with CAD. CAD, it's lines, it's drawings. If you kind of said, well, how do you move into something a little bit more 2D, a little bit more 3D, a bit of a mix, you're trying to look at the efficiencies that you can possibly gain with that. And it started to develop into what they defined as level 1. And you could kind of think of it in the sense of, when you've been working on BIM projects and you maybe are exchanging files back and forth, but you're maybe not as collaborative, maybe not, you're not taking it to that full level. BIM Level 2 was about identifying that there was going to be different pieces in place, bringing the models together. It was identifying what were the standards behind it. And it's funny because actually hearing the guys, Merv and the others that actually designed this diagram, they actually said if they knew it was going to be used this much, they would have put more time into it. They said it was kind of sketched out on the back of a napkin one evening. It suddenly took off like wildfire. But it does explain where we're trying to go, which is that this is an evolution. This is not BIM Level 2, that's it, we're great, we've achieved BIM, that's it, and we're done. That's Level 2, so then, and then you get into Level 3 and, what's the next step. So as part of that, they took the step and they started sort of saying, well, we need standards. And I'll get into kind of what these different pieces are, but these were the foundation blocks that they needed to build on. They knew that the problem within the industry right now is that everybody's kind of doing things differently and everyone's kind of talking about things a different way. So how do you get it so that people understand exactly what they're talking about? And within the UK, I should say that they have a big emphasis on standards. From what I understand, you can actually look up the British Standard on how to make a cup of tea. They like to document and put together these specifications for things. So it's great, but then there's this sort of application of what it's about. And what I'm going to try to capture as we get into them a bit more is what's the concept behind them? What's the actual purpose of it? Because if you understand a lot of these, if you read them, they're very technical and hard to read. But if you understand the concept of what they're trying to achieve, then suddenly you can go and talk to people about it, and it makes a heck of a lot more sense. So upon these foundations and these standards, they started to devise how this would start to evolve. So what they were they drew a line in the sand and said, let's try to get to level 2 for April 2016. Beyond that, there is a strategy for level 3. You can actually start, if you start searching the web for level 3 BIM, you will find basically the strategy involved in what they're thinking. It's much more of a bigger picture kind of thinking about a bigger kind of evolution of, like they kind of call it social BIM. It's this much more fully integrated system. And it's looking at a much bigger evolution. But what was funny is within the UK, just to kind of give you a funny idea of this, is everyone sort of said, well, are you working on a level 1 project, a level 2 project? Oh no, we're working on level 3. Actually, within our practice, we're doing level 4. And everyone was kind of like, when I actually took the course, it was really funny to hear the guys that drew this diagram going, how can anyone be working on a level 3 project when we haven't even finished defining the specification for level 2? So within the industry, it kind of started becoming a bit of a BIM wash. So be aware that if you look out on the web for level 3 projects and level 4 projects, that they don't actually exist because the standard doesn't actually exist yet. So with that, they kind of had this bigger piece. So as I said, the government kind of made that line in the sand. They said this is where they want to get to. But with that idea that the future is coming, it's that idea that we know that we're trying to get to this almighty futuristic world where everything's integrated and it's magical, but at the same time, we kind of have a direction. We're not quite there yet. So the BIM level 3 and BIM level 4s and stuff, that's all kind of coming. But for now, it was kind of trying to achieve that first level. So that kind of gives you an idea of the level 2. The other thing is what the actual standard was, is they identified the need for standards. But whereas you'll hear about things within the industry like ISO 9001 is a well-established, ISO standard that I've used within architectural practices. But why is this not an ISO standard? Well, they explained that an ISO takes about 4 years to produce. A British standard takes less time. But what they actually identified is that British standards are usually been tested and are proven. So what they came out with was a PAS, or a publicly available specification. And it takes about 6 months to produce, but it hasn't been proven. So this was actually being beta tested essentially within the industry. So it was developed, they put it out there and said, okay, here you guys go, run with it. And so when you see PAS and you're wondering what the difference between a PAS and a BS is, it's publicly available specification versus a British standard. So with that in mind, they are developed, though, by recognized standards organizations within the UK. And the stuff that's right now as a PAS is actually being looked to be either adopted as a British standard or developed into a full ISO for international use. So the question inevitably, before we get into the details, and you'll sort of see a bit more about, you'll understand it with the details, is how do they compare? Now, it was interesting kind of doing a comparison back and forth, because I felt like the stuff that they developed as BIM level 2 at the beginning here, it was, internationally, it's been recognized as kind of a leading piece within the industry. It's very holistic, very complete. They've tried to think of it from all different aspects. It was driven by a central government, had industry input, and it was set up to become an ISO standard. So it was developed after the kind of a lot of the standards that have been developed in the US, but it was developed faster. And I think in that case, as I said, they kind of had a chance to kind of pause and reflect on it and sort of build on the best pieces that they found from other places, but holistically, they kind of tackled it as one piece. Within the different pieces that I've seen, come out of the, the different other groups, thinking about kind of AIA, the NBIM standards, the stuff from BIM Forum, there's bits and pieces that I can agree with and I like, but it kind of felt like with the UK, they almost had, like within certain specifications and certain documents, they refer to the other standards that have also been developed. So there was kind of this overlap back and forth that it felt like it was almost like one team unitedly doing it, whereas I think the piece that that sort of developed in North America so far has felt like it does have reference back and forth, and the pieces are good, but it almost feels as though it was a bit more fractured because it was kind of dealing, I think it was one of those ones where everyone kind of jumped into adopting Revit and adopting other BIM programs and workflows, and it started to kind of get into, this question of kind of how do we do it and how do we, even things like when I look at things like the BIM forum, it's a great document, but it's also kind of every now and then I'm like, well, why isn't it a searchable database? Why is it a PDF that I download? And I think that's because that's the way it was produced initially. So I think it's one of these ones that you'll see how that kind of comes into flow with some of the stuff when we talk to BIM Level 2, as well as you'll hear about the AEC UK BIM protocols. These are actually completely separate. And if you talk to the guys that developed BIM Level 2, they actually bash this standard. In other words, they're like, this wasn't developed by any standards organization. It is something that, though it's deeply rooted, it was around long before BIM Level 2. But from my feeling of what I experienced there is it was kind of the piece that quickly got swept aside because it couldn't keep up. It definitely has some useful information and thoughts in it, but it was kind of, I think it was a bit more addressing, what are our Revit standards, what are our modeling standards, as opposed to what is lifecycle management for information, which is, I think, a lot more what BIM got into, BIM Level 2 got into. The other thing is I should say, like, about the standards organizations that are backing this is basically it started shaping and changing a lot of different groups. There's things like within the UK, they like, just to give you an example of what I was used to dealing with, RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, actually changed how they used to refer to their stages of delivery for a project from A, B, C, D to 1, 2, 3, and completely shifted what was in each phase, because they understood that you couldn't, in the same way that we sort of think about, okay, we work on our concept design, we get into construction documents and what pieces are in those different phases. Like, they actually break it down into, as I said, they love their standards, into these specific stages, but they could actually, you could go in and document, and you could see exactly what fell into each standard. And they developed this because they realized that there were things about BIM that were changing it and different things that were happening within the industry. So, the fact that a tendering of a project could happen at different phases, broken down at different points, that actually shaped the way they created stuff. So they actually created these different pieces. They had BIM overlays, and this impacted architecture, engineering, the surveyors group. So everybody was kind of getting on board with it. And I thought that was kind of really interesting to see within the industry how fast that came together. So a lot of people say, okay, well, what is BIM Level 2? So as I said, and just quickly mentioning that, yes, from what I understand, it is being developed into an ISO standard, or at least pieces of it are. But what you see on the screen, and by the way, this presentation does have a link at the end, so you can come back and visit it. So please, if you're jotting down all this stuff really, really quickly, I did provide a link, so you guys can go through and view it at your own. But these pieces are basically the pillars of BIM Level 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these to give you a little bit more in depth. Some of them are, easy to understand. Some of them are quite difficult. Some of them, anything that's a PAS is typically available for free. It's out there, you can download it. Some of the British Standard ones you actually have to purchase off of the BSI website. But pretty much if you start Googling and looking around for these, or if you go to the BIM Task Group website, they'll have links to a lot of these different documents. But like I said, once we understand the concept of it, these are things that I still refer to when I'm talking to, for example, we sit down with clients and we talk to them about, well, what are your BIM requirements on a project? And this is stuff that I've actually learned from these different pieces. So to kind of give you a quick little dive into it, I'll kind of step through a few of these documents. So starting out that this, as I said, this had a bit of history. The British Standard 1192 and 2007 was actually a document that was created quite some time ago, but it was specifically starting to look at how do you improve the best, how do you get more collaboration, proper exchange of files, how do you actually get that to properly happen on a project as you're developing this. And this started years ago when they actually said that they were piloting these concepts on projects where they actually had the opportunity to build two buildings that were identical but mirror images of themselves, where they actually applied like these standards to one of the projects, and then the other one they ran traditionally. And they said that it was amazing. That's how they actually established things like the 20% possible savings, because they've actually tested this on projects. So it's been hanging around for a while, but this sort of starts about, you know, how you need to exchange files, naming conventions are important, and all that sort of stuff. And it's a good document. You know, it talks about things like a common data environment, exchange protocols. It aided with collaboration, but the problem with this was when it actually came to BIM in 2011, when they established the strategy, it was out of date. It never thought about exchanging models and how you do that and what would be involved in it. So the first document they actually tackled was the PAS 1192 Part 2. So when you see the -2, they usually refer to it as Part 2. And this document, this is the document that applies to basically the design and construction phases. So if you're an architectural practice, engineering, if you're trying to talk about that early concept design stuff, as well as if you're a contractor, this is the document you would refer to and flip through, and it has a bulk of it. And so this is, of course, obviously the document I've gotten to know the most. So, you know, and just to kind of give you, you can go through it and it covers a lot of things, like it goes into naming conventions for model files, how it developed the standard naming convention. So if you worked on a project, there were certain pieces of this where you could say, we're doing this as a BIM level 2 job, because and when it referred to that, you can say naming convention as per PAS 1192 Part 2. So instantly it gave the industry an ability, and this is the reason why the standards are very good, is because instantly within the industry, a whole bunch of people that were arguing about naming conventions on your files, and I'm sure you guys have run into this as well, is they sort of said, well, why don't we just adopt this standard and go with it? Now, actually, and before I get ahead of myself, I should say this also, though, led to some confusion within the industry, because a lot of the companies would come in and sort of say, well, can you deliver a BIM level 2 job? And we say, yes, we can. And they go, great. And then we'd say, well, what are your requirements? And they'd say, what do you mean? Our requirement is a BIM level 2 job. And what these specifications have in them is they have some standards that you follow, some best practices and processes that you need to follow, but it didn't actually have requirements in it. And I'll dive into that in a little bit more in one of these diagrams to kind of show you how it works. So there are things where it sort of talks about, you know, and to give you an example, so talking about things like a common data environment. And this is one where they talked about this from the standpoint that you'll hear the term start to creep up in North America as well, but they very commonly set a CDE in a lot of different projects, and a lot of it is about a central depository for holding the information. The idea of it is that if you're exchanging things constantly back and forth in emails, if somebody isn't copied on that email, they don't necessarily have access to the latest approved models. They don't have access to the latest shared drawings. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to basically create an environment where you said, okay, if we set it up in this way and follow these rules, then we will have a better workflow, because what happens is the information is a work in progress. Within the individual disciplines or teams, they'll approve that information. It goes into a shared environment where that shared information is reviewed. It's the client can review it, the teams can collaborate, you can, exchange files and make sure that you've got the latest information. But then they also had this idea that you had to have approval to have things that were authorized to move into a published section. And that idea that if you know that the document, for example, is a published document, and I'm thinking the way I interpreted this, it was if you have a model that's sort of a work in progress, yes, it's kind of on the fly, that's probably on your local system. You upload it to the shared site where everyone can exchange, or if you're working with a live system, it's exchanged live, and other consultants can view that, but it's not issued for tender, it's not issued for construction, it's not an official authorized document. And then so from that document could be issued for construction, in which it would be moved into published status, and then it would replace an existing file, and therefore that existing file would be archived. And the idea of this is that, and this could be done not necessarily in folders, but it could be done through some sort of system that tracked it. So there was this whole big thing within the industry of, well, which CDE are you using? And a lot of this came down to that as long as it was more about understanding what is that process doing, it's the fact that you're controlling who has access to the information for what. But it's very useful to kind of understand that, and understanding who is involved in that, because in the document it actually talks about who is authorized. It actually is a client representative that should be authorized to say, yes, this model is issued for construction. These drawings are issued for construction. They have reviewed them, they have authorized them, but it is up to the teams to approve them within the shared environment, and to maintain that you could always go and find the latest shared model or the latest published model. And the other thing was it also started to shape how we actually created our models and what we named them. And that also got carried through into PAS 1192 Part 3, which I'll mention in a second, which started to look at the operation side of things. So basically, if you can imagine that same workflow of the information being done within a team that's actually doing the operations or facilities management, or if they do some sort of renovation to it, that still has to happen before the information can actually be, before people know that people had to understand what status the information was at. So that was something that they captured as kind of the bigger life cycle of it. And so they actually came out with this diagram, and this is an expanded version of the one that you'll find in BIM Level 2 under this PAS 1192 Part 2. And I know it's a little bit hard to read here, so I'm going to dive into it a little bit. But the idea is that we had these projects that were BIM, and we could do BIM at the design construction phase. But if you worked back, the other thing that was really interesting to see for the industry, and what I think was the bigger piece about all this, was that they said, this isn't about how you design and the concept and which version of Revit you're using. And I know I refer to Revit a lot, but that's just because I've used it. We use it on so many projects and everything like that. But what I'm saying is, it's not just about the technology. It's about what's the life cycle of this. And what they actually did was they started right here at the beginning of the process, and they said, okay, well, the CapEx, the capital expenditure, the project's going to start with your employer's information requirements. And so we used to go to our clients and go, well, what's your requirements for the project for BIM? And they'd say, I don't know, what can I get? And it took me a while before I actually could go back to them and start to actually talk to them about EIRs, AIRs, and OIRs. And by the way, they love their acronyms in all these different standards. But within the industry, you started to speak a common language. You could actually say to somebody, well, where's your EIR? And people within the BIM knowledge would actually know what you're talking about. And so the standards help that out. But the employer's information requirements is basically the requirements for the individual project. Now you'd say, well, how do you know that? Well, it's driven by what information you need for your assets. And the reason they said assets is it's not just about buildings. It could be a power plant, it could be a bridge. So it's not buildings, but it's an asset. And how do you define the requirements? Well, it's how you're going to manage that asset. What's the information you need? What's the system that you're going to be using to maintain it? Are you using computer-aided facilities management? Are you storing everything in Excel files? Are you doing everything in paper? You know, like if you need printed drawings, that technically is your requirement because that's how you're managing your asset. But that asset information, going back to an organization and talking to, you know, when we're talking to developers, when we're talking to clients about their sites, when we're talking to local authorities or government officials, you're talking to them about their organizational strategy. It's if they say, well, our organizational strategy is that we want to save X amount by doing this with our management of our projects, then that will then fold into what our actual employer's information requirements are. So it's something that is a much bigger strategy piece of it. Along with that, there was the BIM protocols, which they specifically identified as BIM protocols were inserted into contracts to cover the legality of the project. So who has access to the files? What can they be used for? What's the ownership when that information is passed from one group to the other? And I'll talk a little bit about BIM protocols afterwards. Then all of that crossed the line and actually came over to the design teams, the contractors, and everybody else through procurement. And so if we received an RFP for a project, the idea was actually, and whether or not they actually do this within the industry, and I should say, a lot of these are the standards they developed, but whether or not they're actually truly done is another thing. But the idea of this was that you were in theory supposed to produce a pre-contract BIM execution plan that outlined how you were going to deliver their requirements. Once you were awarded the contract, then you delivered that into a full execution plan, as well as building things like a master information delivery plan, which kind of outlined whose information was being exchanged what. But within this, they clarified that the BIM execution plan has nothing to do with, this is not a document coming from the client. This is a document that was coming from the team as a way of explaining how we're going to deliver the project back, to answer the employer's information requirements. So from that, all of that then went into the project, and you started to get into mobilization, checking that all the systems were set up. You got into the project, you started to develop all the information together. All of that information then came as data drops that they used to refer to. And the idea that they even came up with this term called soft landings, which is that if you're an employer and you need to make decisions at certain points, there's certain information you need from the process. So they called them data drops. It might be initially you need a list of rooms, then you need full room data sheets, then you need the room data sheets plus the specifications of all the things going in that room. And the idea of this was that you also build up the information if you're doing an exchange into databases, because it allows you time to do the information exchange and put it into the system and test out whether or not it's coming through correctly, so that you didn't get to this whole thing with handover where the operation started and you suddenly ended up with this massive amount of information being dropped on you and the team being overwhelmed. It's the idea that you did soft landings. And they also, as I said, looked at, okay, so if PAS 1192 Part 2 was that section beforehand, operations then is that if you're doing major works, transfer of ownership, breakdown, maintenance, all that sort of stuff, you've got all of that happening, and they need a specification as well. So they had an asset information model as opposed to a project information model, and that was maintained where you just kind of made a subtle changes, but things would change over time. And then even the fact that that all led into what happened at the end of the life of the project when you're decommissioning. So this is an expanded version of what you'll find in there, but it helped clarify a lot of what we needed to understand about the workflow of what needed to happen. And this is a diagram that I still refer back to with clients, because I think it really does actually explain what BIM is supposed to be about. What happens within the individual little pockets and the exchange of information between different people is all captured as part of a BIM execution plan, and that's just up to those groups to kind of really understand. Now, the other pieces of this is, for example, if you've got things like, who's viewing what? or sorry, who's doing what on a project. There was a whole thing of roles on a project. And I'm sure you've kind of run into this on projects is, well, who's supposed to be doing the BIM stuff? And what's supposed to be coming from the client? And what do the individual teams need to do on a project? So they came up with this whole concept that they define these roles, and this is just kind of a point form summary, so you can come back and read it later, but it's this idea that individuals could be assigned to these things, or more than one individual could be assigned to it, but these were roles that were specific. So when we talked to clients and they said, okay, well, let's set up who is going to be the actual project information manager, who is going to be responsible for collating all the information coming from all the different groups together and making sure that that translates over to the client properly. And that's a project role, and it was a big role on projects. So there's all these different pieces of it. And like I said, you guys can come back and read this at another time, but you'll see specific things, you know, and that, you know, the employer's representative is the one that accepts models in the CDE. So that was a specific role that they had to have. Construction and design leads were the ones that assigned levels of definition, or LODs. You know, so there's different specific things that are important, but within task teams, you know, it's the fact that who's managing the clash detection. So you had to identify people for these different roles. And like I said, this sounds like a lot, and whether or not it actually happens on all the BIM Level 2 projects, that was the idea and the goal that they were trying to get to. So that gives you an idea of one of the specifications. The other pieces here, so 1192 Part 3 was basically the same as Part 2, but for operations and facilities management phase of asset management. So it's looking at what is that workflow when you kind of break it down, when you're not dealing with a large architectural practice and engineering group and landscape all coming together. It was more about, okay, we just need to maintain our facility. What are we actually doing on it? Security, it's one of those ones that if you're in an open collaborative environment, but you have things like you're dealing with the Department of Defense, how do you actually deal with that? This was one where they started to look at specifications for security. But keeping in mind, what's my feedback on when I've dealt, I personally never actually had to deal with this specification, but it was one of those ones that the groups that the other BIM managers that I dealt with that did have to deal with it, the feedback was that it was an all or nothing approach. It was one of those ones that if you had a very super secure project, yes, it applied. But if you had something that was kind of, well, yeah, we want to keep it as secure, but it's not quite an embassy or a missile silo, then yeah, you're probably not dealing with it. You know, you couldn't take bits and pieces of it. So something to kind of keep in mind with that. They had the development of COBie UK, which was, of course, the fact that you know we've heard about COBie, but it was recognized that they needed to have a way to exchange information that was a recognized standard. So the idea here was to sort of say, okay, we will adopt COBie, but they of course came up with a slightly tweaked version of it. So PAS 1190, and I should actually say that's actually British Standard 1192 Part 4. Actually, that's not Part 5. But you can see that's it was identifying about the need for COBie in that regards. Then there was also the BIM Protocol. So as I mentioned, you can take a look through it, but of course, contracts in the UK are completely different than they are, or a lot of the times are very different than they are in North America. So they did have, it was kind of one of these ones that was well-intentioned, but there was stuff like, for example, it tried to cover the design and construction phase, but then in that there was conflicts between the two. So there was something where you couldn't actually take this document and just insert it into a contract. You had to amend it, and there was all these sort of pieces of getting lots of lawyers involved. It was a lot of fun. The digital plan of works is something that you guys actually can have access to. If you search for the MBS BIM Toolkit and the MBS National BIM Library, it's actually quite interesting because this was MBS is basically, if you guys have seen if you've seen the BIM forum LOD's definition, this was a way that they were actually trying to build this into a website where you could actually go in here and not only search for different things. So if you wanted to look up door sets, you could actually see what a stage 3 level of detail or level of development was for a door set. But then the other thing about it is they also developed it for level of information, because they identified that there's the level of geometry, but then there's also how much information is embedded in the model. as well as they also tried to establish this as a tool for building your BIM requirements. The only problem with that is that they failed to kind of capture that introductory level of things. So it kind of felt like they kind of threw you straight into the depths of a project. And a lot of clients, I think, need an ease into this when they're putting together their BIM requirements. So it didn't really help them develop an EIR for the project because it never really explained to them what an EIR was. But in some ways, this was kind of supposed to be that answer to it. So a few more here, very quick kind of pieces. Sorry, going on. The standards for facilities management, so a British standard that looked for a bit more about how to manage facilities management on that side of things. So I think it was kind of building on from just the procedures of kind of BIM on it, which part 3 covered. There was a classification system, so I'm sure a lot of people have kind of worked with master format, OmniClass, CSI specifications. The idea, of course, is that inside the UK, they didn't have a system yet. They had started with Uniclass 2, and they sort of said that, well, we'll update that. And because there was things like they said, a berm on the side of a highway didn't have a number for it yet. So they had to update the coding system so that there was a code for everything. And the problem with this, of course, is the fact that if you constantly change the specification classification, most people in the UK were still using an old system used by MBS, let alone Uniclass 2. And so when you presented them with even a new one, they were kind of like, well, we're still using something that was developed in the 70s. So there was a need to update, but it was coming. And there's a lot of other good resources, templates, and things like they had a BIM execution plan. They had assessments so that the client could, for example, issue out a questionnaire to clients, or sorry, to consultants and say, okay, fill out this questionnaire to tell us how well you do BIM or what your IT infrastructure is like. The problem with them was they were good concept, but they needed some sort of replacement. So I think within the industry, there was more of a recognition that it was more about getting your organization BIM Level 2 certified and to become an accredited professional. And then that was a better way to sort of be able to say, this is what we do. There was other things like the EIR template that was developed was never actually a template. It was just kind of an example or an outline, and the problem was everyone just threw it in as is. I even went so far as to see that there were people out there that tried to sort of educate people as this is an EIR and provide examples. And I actually found one website where the person had replaced the PDF with just a PDF that said, please stop trying to reference my document because too many people have taken this and just thrown it into contracts, not actually reading it. So it was kind of one of these ones of everyone was so eager to just be able to pick up something and throw it in, but what they actually needed to do was review it and sort of see it as a whole. So that kind of gives you an idea of the bigger pieces of it. But what can we learn from all of this? The fact that, whether we're looking at what's coming out of the States, because yes, we're right next door and we get influenced by it, but, within groups like Building Smart Canada, and I've been talking to people about from the CanBIM side of things about it as well, because they're trying to do education, but I'm saying, well, how can you educate people on it if the industry within Canada doesn't develop a standard? Because as I said, it's a need for common language. It's a need for understanding what the framework is and what it does, and for the education of clients. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think that there's a lot of pieces here that we can pull from. And, that's super useful when we kind of start to look at, well, where do we want to go with BIM in Canada? So if you want to find out more about it, the BIMtaskgroup.org is one possible solution. I also recommend the BIM B1M, I believe is how they actually say it, is a great series of videos that you can actually see in that. Because they're out of the UK, they've got little 5-minute videos on, here's an introduction to PAS 1192 Part 2, and here's an introduction to an EIR. And so they're a useful kind of quick little resource. So that's my presentation. We'll open it up for questions, and there's a link right there on the screen if you want to kind of jot it down quickly. That'll bring you back to the Prezi so that you can sit there and view it on your own. Okay.
Thank you very much, Krigh. That was a very, very great overview, and I love how we sort of look at these documents from afar, and you really put the pieces together and how this all fits. It's definitely some great inspiration to be had from the UK. So I'm going to open it up for questions in the audience if there's anybody that has specific questions. And I'll start the ball rolling. There's a question here. Okay, the link. Krigh, do you mind putting the link in the chat box? Is that something you can do while I ask the question?
I believe I can. Let me just switch back over to it here.
And so while you're doing that, one of the probably the principal questions is around the context, and this is a recurring theme of mine and ours in the UK context and the Canadian context are very different because of the power that the central government has over dictating these standards and going about developing a strategy and pushing it out, and a mandate. We have the province, we have multiple levels. How do you see that hurdle being overcome in Canada if we were to learn from the UK?
It's a tough one, because a lot of people have said to me, well, should it be the central government that steps in here like the way the UK government did? I do believe, though, that within Canada, exactly what you said, the whole thing of like the provinces, I think bring into question a lot more, because things here are a lot more fractured. We were within my time in the UK, whether you were talking about the national health system or BIM standards, everything was much more unified because it was a smaller group to kind of bring together. I believe that it is something that needs to be driven by a central group, but it either needs to be a recognized industry alliance, or it needs to be driven by, a central government. I think that if we end up, and I think it's one of those ones that, to me, it's something that we really need soon, because the problem is, I can see that if the central government doesn't step in, or if the industry doesn't unite and kind of say, okay, let's put together a task force for this, that we're going to end up with, things happening where municipalities and provinces end up trying to develop their own standards, and then you're going to end up with this thing of, well, are we working on an Ontario BIM project or a British Columbia one? I think we have a possibility there where things could fracture even worse.
Well, that's sort of brings on to the next question. There's I'm going to ask this person to reformulate the question, because it's a bit difficult to answer in its current form. But while the person reformulates the question, who should be? So you talked about a centralized organization or a coalition of sorts. There are things in Canada like the National Building Code that are initiatives that are coming, top down from the federal body into the provinces, being rejigged and so forth. How important is that sort of consistency across the country? How important is that, in your opinion? Because it would seem to be way more important for larger firms that actually have offices in different provinces than, say, SMEs that only operate within one region. Can you sort of speak to that?
Yeah, I think from my standpoint of what I've seen, I would say it's difficult to say, because you kind of, if you had you have to deal with one province or one standard, yeah, it's a bit easier. But at the same time, I think from my standpoint, being able to have something that's unified, that has common terminology across the board, like even what are we calling these BIM requirements in Canada? Because you can't, we even got into the fact that I was working with our specifications team here, and they were saying, oh, you can't call it an employer's information requirements, because requirements means something different here than it does in the UK. So there's this whole language piece to it. But I think that I think it's one of those ones that if we can get at least the commonality of saying these are the pieces that like the language that's common and the pieces that are consistent. And the other thing about BIM Level 2, like the main thing that I emphasize with it, is it's not about the specific requirements on it. Even though you would sort of say, so you could vary the requirements within one province or within one municipality that's different than another section. It's about an understanding of which pieces are important to have there, which pieces need to be consistent. So if the naming convention in one province is different than another, that wouldn't be such an issue. But it's understanding that, okay, we need a naming convention as part of it is the important part, I think. And by the way, one thing I did miss in the presentation that I should mention is the fact that the requirement as of April 2016 by the central government is only to the local or to the government groups is to have an EIR or an employer's information requirements on their project. It doesn't actually state what the requirements have to be. They just have to be issuing out their requirements. Just something that I forgot to mention as I was going through the presentation.
Excellent, thanks. So there's two questions, and we're on time here. One question here around maybe to finish up. What was the role of the different industry associations in developing the UK standards? Like you said, you mentioned that they were beta tested. How did the associations react? You talked about REBA. Were the other associations involved in the development of the standards?
I don't know the full extent of it, but from what I understand, there's all sorts of different, like they brought in industry groups within it. They kind of tapped out to a lot of the different organizations that kind of head up, like I said, like the different ones I listed there were groups that were kind of consulted as it went through. So the thing about the BIM Task Group is that it was a government funded team that, you know, like David Phelps that kind of led it, you know, like during his time in the industry, he was heading up Mace, which is one of the biggest contractors in the UK. So his input from that standpoint was he was actually a member of the industry feeding back, you know, he would be involved in it. So as I understand it, the different groups were kind of consulted in it as it developed. And you know, even within my local, the group from the local authorities, we actually had a voice to be able to pass things back up to the task group. So there were all sorts of different little pockets, and my group was made up of local authorities, people, you know, like myself in architecture and engineering. So it was one of these ones that I think overall there was a lot of consulting that kind of happened between the different groups.
Excellent. So is that sort of bottom up, top down approach that seems to be becoming the norm.
It really seemed to unify. Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
Go on.
No, I was just going to say that I think that's really seems to be.
No.
Sorry, Krigh. I'm gonna end it here.
Yeah, no, sorry, it got a little bit choppy there for a second.
Yeah, it's raining in Vancouver, so usually TELUS goes down. I'm gonna end it here because we're on time. Susan, I'm gonna hand it back to you to close the meeting. And thank you again, Krigh, for your excellent presentation and your answers.
Sure. So thanks again, Krigh, for the presentation. You raised some really good points that we'll carry through further. Some points that we've batted around quite a lot between us as well for our path forward and next steps. I do encourage everyone to continue to get on the forum because a lot of these discussions are going to be well served through that forum. And moving forward in Canada, a lot of that discussion and experiential information that we need to move forward would be great to capture in the forum. So for our next meeting in 1 month's time, we are scheduled for Monday, April 24th. You will get an invite sent out through our newsletter, so keep your eye on the newsletter. We are headed to the next Building Smart International Technical Summit This is taking place next week. And so we are pleased to be able to bring back the points of interest for Canada that we see during that time at our next meeting. Again, if you have any other presentation requests, either topic-wise or speaker-wise, again, you're welcome to contact us at information@ibc-bsc.ca. And again, through the newsletter, Eric will include that link to Krigh's Prezi as well, if you didn't get a chance to jot that down. So thanks again to Krigh. Thank you to Eric as well. And we hope to see you again in a month's time for our next presentation. Bye for now.
Thank you all.